I still remember that night like it was yesterday, though I wish I didn't. If I could, I'd wipe it clean from my memory and pretend none of it ever happened. But the truth has a way of clawing its way back, no matter how deep you try to bury it. It started, as these things often do, innocently enough. I was driving the familiar stretch of Route 87, the highway shimmering under the moonlight. It was late, past midnight, and the road was quiet, almost eerily so. I was heading home to Midland after a long day of meetings in Dallas, and my eyelids were getting heavier with every mile. That gas station was my saving grace, a regular stop where I could stretch my legs, grab a coffee, and keep going. The place hadn't changed in years. 2 pumps, a flickering neon sign, and a convenience store that looked like it hadn't seen a renovation since the 80s. But it was familiar, and that's what mattered. I pulled up to the pump, the fluorescent lights casting long shadows over the cracked asphalt. As I stepped out of the truck, the faint smell of gasoline hit me, a sharp, almost metallic tang that seemed stronger than usual. I brushed it off. It was a gas station, after all. Inside, the store was empty, as expected. The bell jingled as I walked in, and Hank, the owner, was sitting behind the counter, flipping through an old magazine. He gave me a nod, the kind you give someone you see often enough but don't really know. I nodded back and headed to the coffee pot. It wasn't until I poured the coffee that I noticed it. A sound. Quiet at first, like the faint hum of machinery. But as I stood there, it grew louder, almost like a low guttural growl. I turned my head toward the sound. It seemed to be coming from the back of the store, near the restrooms. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "Everything okay back there, Hank?" I asked, my voice sounding steadier than I felt. Hank didn't look up. "Yeah, just the old cooler acting up again. Been making noises all week." But it didn't sound like a cooler. It sounded alive, like something breathing. I told myself I was just tired, that my mind was playing tricks on me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I made my way to the restroom, the smell of gasoline growing stronger with every step. By the time I reached the door, it was almost overpowering. My hand hovered over the doorknob, hesitation creeping in. I should have turned around right then and there. But curiosity, or maybe stupidity, got the better of me. The restroom was dimly lit, the flickering fluorescent bulb casting strange shadows on the grimy tiles. It was empty, just as I'd expected, but the smell of gasoline was unbearable now, thick and choking. I splashed some water on my face, trying to shake off the unease. That's when I saw it. In the mirror, just over my shoulder, there was movement, a shadow. I spun around, heart pounding. But there was nothing there. The room was empty, silent except for the faint buzz of the flickering light. I backed out of the restroom, my pulse racing. The air felt heavy, suffocating, and the growling sound was louder now, resonating through the store. Hank was gone. The stool he'd been sitting on was tipped over, his magazine lying open on the floor. The coffee I'd poured was still sitting on the counter, untouched. And then I heard it. A whisper, low and guttural, coming from the back of the store. My name. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. Someone, or something, was calling me. I bolted for the door, my boots echoing on the linoleum. The bell jingled as I stepped out, and for a moment I thought I was safe. But my truck wasn't where I'd left it. The pumps were empty, the lot silent except for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. The smell of gasoline clung to the air, stronger than ever. Panic set in. I grabbed my phone, but the screen stayed dark no matter how many times I pressed the power button. The silence was deafening now, pressing down on me like a weight. And then I saw it. A black car, idling at the edge of the lot. Its headlights were off, but I could see the faint outline of a figure in the driver's seat. The growling sound was louder now, almost deafening, and it was coming from the car. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to get away. The desert stretched out before me, endless and unforgiving. The ground was uneven, the rocks sharp under my boots. But I didn't stop. Behind me, the growling turned into a roar, and I could hear the car's engine revving. It followed me, its headlights cutting through the darkness like twin blades. No matter how fast I ran, it was always just behind me, closing the distance. My lungs burned, my legs felt like lead, but fear kept me moving. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The car was gone. The growling was gone. The desert was silent again, the only sound my ragged breathing. I don't remember how I made it back to the gas station, but when I did, everything was normal. My truck was back at the pump, my coffee still sitting on the counter. Hank was behind the counter again, flipping through his magazine like nothing had happened. "You okay there, David?" he asked, not looking up. I didn't answer. I just got in my truck and drove. I didn't stop until I was home, the faint smell of gasoline still clinging to my clothes. That was 3 years ago. I haven't been back to that gas station since. I don't take Route 87 anymore, but sometimes, late at night, I hear it. The growling, low and guttural, just outside my window. And I smell it. Gasoline. It was the kind of dare you couldn't back down from, no matter how stupid it sounded. My buddy Jake and I had been passing through Maine, heading south on I-95, when he brought it up. "Ever heard of Whispering Pines Rest Stop?" he asked, a grin creeping onto his face. I shook my head. Should I? Jake chuckled, his eyes gleaming in the glow of the dashboard lights. "You like spooky crap. This place has it all. Ghosts, screams, weird shadows in the trees. Truckers swear by it." I laughed, but it came out hollow. "So what? We pull over, take some selfies, and call it a night?" "Not just selfies." Jake leaned closer, his voice dropping. "We spend the night there, full investigation. Just you, me, and whatever's left of Whispering Pines." I should have said no. Should have kept driving. But Jake knew me too well. The idea of exploring an abandoned, haunted rest stop had its hooks in me before I could think better of it. So, against my better judgment, I agreed. It was nearly midnight when we spotted the rusted sign, barely visible through the veil of pines. Jake turned onto the cracked, overgrown driveway, the headlights cutting through the mist that hung low over the ground. The rest stop was just as eerie as he'd described, boarded-up windows, graffiti scrawled across the walls, and a rusted swing set swaying in the breeze like a metronome counting down the seconds. We parked the car and stepped out into the heavy, damp air. The forest around us was unnervingly quiet, the kind of silence that made you feel like you were being watched. Jake grabbed his flashlight and camcorder, while I pocketed my phone and a hunting knife, just in case. "This is going to be epic," Jake said, his enthusiasm cutting through the creeping dread that was already settling in my gut. I nodded, trying to match his bravado, but the shadows pressing in around us told a different story. The main building was a hulking silhouette against the moonlight, its roof partially caved in from the storm that had sealed its fate. We stepped through the splintered doorway, the beam of Jake's flashlight slicing through the darkness. The air inside was thick and musty, tinged with the metallic scent of decay. At first it was just what I expected: broken furniture, shattered glass, and the eerie quiet of a place long forgotten. Jake started filming, narrating in a dramatic tone about the history of whispering pines. I chuckled at his theatrics, but the sound echoed too loudly in the empty space, sending a shiver down my spine. Then the whispers began. At first I thought it was the wind, soft, almost melodic, like leaves brushing against each other. But as we moved deeper into the building, the whispers grew louder, distinct, their cadence strange. It wasn't the wind. It was voices. Jake stopped mid-sentence, his flashlight trembling slightly. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, my grip tightening on the knife in my pocket. The whispers seemed to be coming from all around us, overlapping, growing in intensity. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but it sounded like my name. My name. "Jake," I started, but he held up a hand, silencing me. His camera was still rolling, its little red light blinking like a heartbeat. He turned toward the far end of the room where the darkness seemed to press in thicker than anywhere else. "Let's check it out," he said, his voice steadier than mine would have been. He led the way, and I followed, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. The whispers grew louder as we approached a door hanging off its hinges. Jake pushed it open, revealing a small, cramped office. The air was colder here, biting against my skin despite the muggy summer night. Jake scanned the room with his flashlight, and that's when we saw it. A figure stood in the corner, shrouded in shadows. Its outline was barely discernible, but its eyes, God, its eyes burned white, like tiny pinpricks of fire. Jake froze, the camcorder slipping from his hands and hitting the floor with a dull thud. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice cracking. The figure didn't move. It didn't blink. It just watched. Then, all at once, it lunged. The room erupted in chaos. The whispers turned to screams, deafening and guttural, as if the walls themselves were alive with agony. Jake bolted, and I was right on his heels, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. We tore through the building, the screams following us, growing louder with every step. As we burst out into the night, I glanced back, and there they were. Dozens of shadowy figures stood in the shattered windows, their glowing eyes fixed on us. They didn't move, but their presence was suffocating, like a weight pressing down on my chest. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. Jake fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped them. Finally, the engine roared to life, and we sped away. The rest stopped disappearing into the trees behind us. But the nightmare didn't end there. As we drove, I glanced into the rearview mirror, and I saw them, shadowy figures standing among the pines, their glowing eyes following us long after the rest stop was out of sight. We didn't talk about it. Not then. Not later. Jake deleted the footage without watching it, and we agreed never to mention Whispering Pines again. But even now I can't shake the feeling that something followed us that night. Something that still lingers just out of sight, waiting. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls and the shadows stretch long, I hear the whispers again. It was late, and I was dead tired. Driving Highway 1 at night was never on my list of good ideas, but here I was, gripping the wheel and squinting through the fog. The Pacific crashed somewhere below, its roar muffled by the thick mist that turned the road into a narrow, winding purgatory. My car was the only sound, apart from the occasional groan of the cliffs as the wind gnawed at them. I should have stayed at the motel back in Monterey, but I was restless, eager to get back home. It was the kind of night where the dark felt heavier, where the fog seemed alive, pressing close like it wanted to wrap itself around you and never let go. Then I saw him. At first I thought it was a trick of the headlights, shapes forming and dissolving in the fog. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't my imagination. A man was standing by the side of the road, tall and wiry, with his thumbs sticking out in the universal hitchhiker's plea. His beard was scraggly, his clothes hung loose on his frame, and his eyes. They caught the light, glowing faintly blue like something unnatural. I wasn't in the habit of picking up strangers, especially not on a desolate stretch of road like this. But there was something about the way he stood there, unmoving, the mist curling around him like he belonged to it. His face was etched with something between desperation and resignation, as if he knew nobody would stop but still hoped someone might. Against every ounce of common sense, I pulled over. I rolled down the passenger side window, my hand trembling against the button. "Need a lift?" He nodded, his face barely moving, but his eyes, those piercing eyes, locked onto mine. He climbed in without a word, bringing with him the smell of damp earth, salt air, and something metallic, faint but sharp, like rusted iron. I cleared my throat, trying to shake off the unease crawling up my spine. "Where you headed?" "South," he said, his voice low and gravelly. That was it. No explanation, no small talk, just south. I should have made him get out right then and there, but I didn't. I couldn't. Something about him made it feel like I was the one trapped, like I'd already made a deal I didn't remember agreeing to. The fog swallowed us as I drove on, the rhythmic thump of the wipers filling the silence. He sat stiff and still, his hands folded in his lap, his gaze fixed straight ahead. I tried to talk a couple of times, but his answers were clipped, and eventually I gave up. The tension in the car grew thick, a second layer of fog pressing against me. Then, out of nowhere, he spoke. "Turn around." His voice startled me so much I nearly jerked the wheel. "What?" "Turn around," he repeated, louder this time, his tone sharp enough to cut. "This road isn't safe." I forced a laugh, though my hands were clammy on the wheel. "Yeah, tell me about it. These cliffs are no joke." He shook his head, and for the first time he looked at me. His eyes burned brighter in the dim light, almost unnatural. "It's not the cliffs. It's them." "Who?" I asked, my voice cracking on the word. "They don't like strangers here." He leaned closer, his breath warm and sour against my cheek. "They're always watching." A chill ran down my spine, colder than the night air seeping through the car. "Who's watching?" I asked, glancing at him out of the corner of my eye. He didn't answer. He just stared at me, his eyes boring into mine like he was waiting for me to figure it out. I laughed again, but it came out hollow. "Look, man, if this is some kind of joke." The headlights flickered, just for a second, but it was enough to send my stomach into free fall. When they came back on, the man was gone. Not gone like he'd opened the door and stepped out. Gone like he had never been there in the first place. The passenger seat was empty, cold, untouched. I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching against the wet pavement as the car skidded to a stop. I threw open my door and got out, the fog swallowing me instantly. "Hey!" I shouted into the mist. "Where the hell are you?" Silence. The road was empty, stretching into nothingness in both directions. My heart hammered against my ribs as I scanned the darkness, half expecting him to materialize out of the fog like some specter. Nothing. I climbed back into the car, slamming the door and locking it, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The metallic scent lingered in the air, stronger now, and I couldn't tell if it was coming from the man, if he had even been real, or from the car itself. I gripped the wheel and forced myself to drive. The fog seemed thicker now, almost solid, and every shadow looked like it was moving. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely keep the car straight. I couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said. They're always watching. I didn't know who they were, and I didn't want to find out. The feeling of being watched grew unbearable. Every turn of the road felt like it was leading me deeper into something I couldn't escape. And then I saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the road, arms outstretched, face obscured by the fog. I swerved, barely avoiding them, my tires skidding on the slick pavement. When I looked in the rearview mirror, the figure was gone. My chest tightened as I realized the metallic smell was stronger now, so strong it made my eyes water. When I finally saw the faint glow of town lights in the distance, I almost cried. I didn't care about the speed limit. I just wanted to be anywhere but on that road. I pulled into a gas station, parked under the harsh fluorescent lights, and got out, my legs shaking. The passenger seat was still cold, still untouched. But in the dim light I noticed something I hadn't seen before, a faint smear of rust red trailing down the seatbelt. I didn't wait to find out what it meant.